Okay. Neil, Sam, I want to introduce our speaker. It's my great pleasure to introduce Commander Mitch Schranz, who is Fleet Marine Force Chaplain Corps, U.S. Navy, retired. And yes, he knows Rabbi Yonatan Warren. They've served in many of the same places, like Okinawa. And it is our pleasure to welcome him today. He's a native of Bronx, New York, which some of us, South Bronx, okay. And began his military career in July 1977 when he was commissioned as second lieutenant in the seminarian program, U.S. Army Reserve. I will not read this entire thing, but just know that he has been all over the world as a chaplain on many foreign shores, on many ships. He was in the Philippines in June 1991 when he helped spearhead relief efforts for Filipino citizens who lost their homes and livelihoods in the wake of Mount Pinatubo volcano's disastrous eruption. He's been at Camp Lejeune, as I said, Okinawa, and he's in Afghanistan, and Iraq, so he's really been around the world. He now serves as the senior chaplain of the Virginia Defense Force, Virginia National Guard. He is married to Cristita Moyar of Taytay, Rizal, Republic of the Philippines. They have 2 children, Rafaela, a nurse in New York City, and Evan, an Army second lieutenant stationed in Germany. My pleasure. Thank you, Rabbi Schranz. We're delighted to have you here.
Just saying thank you to President Hyman, is it? Thank you. And thank you, all of you, for coming. When she mentioned I was in the Fleet Marine Force, the Marines, you probably know, is part of the Navy. So I was assigned to the Marines for 11 years. And I'm not talking about being assigned to paper pushing Marines in a nice air-conditioned office in the Pentagon. I'm talking about warfighting Marines, infantry, armor, etc. Of course, I was a lot younger and a lot thinner back then. So probably looking at me and saying, how could I have possibly been assigned to the Marines? But years ago, I was assigned to Camp Lejeune, North Carolina, and I had just gotten there from the Philippines, from overseas. And I was getting used to the lay of the land, as is the case when you move to a new place. And there was a main road leading into the main gate at Camp Lejeune. And you'd always see Marines walking on the road to get to work in the morning because they didn't have transportation or car, and people would routinely stop and pick them up and drive them into the base. So I adopted the same minhag, the same custom, and I met a lot of interesting young Marines in doing that. One day, I picked up, shortly after I got there, I picked up this young Marine, and he didn't know I was a chaplain or a rabbi. I was wearing my jacket, so I couldn't see my insignia. And we were talking, nice young man. And I realized he was Jewish. Told me he had a bar mitzvah and so on and so forth. So I said to him, my understanding is that they have Jewish services on base. Do you ever go? He said, yes, I used to go, but then I was deployed And when I got back, I started to hang out with my friends on Friday night, meaning going drinking and getting stoned. So I said to him, well, you know, Marine, that I heard that there is a new rabbi there, so you might want to check it out. He said, yes, sir, I heard that too, but I also heard he's not so great. So, so you know what? I kind of agree with him. I'm not so great. So don't expect any great insights or to learn anything that's going to profoundly change your life in the next hour or so, either for the good or for the worse. I'm not so great, and don't have such high expectations of me and my presentation. Kind of like the Dan Quayle factor. Does anybody know what the Dan Quayle factor is? Or was? That's right, but do you know what the Dan Quayle factor specifically was? Well, Dan Quayle didn't appear to be the most intelligent person in Washington, and kind of not intelligent. So they used to say, how could somebody like him be vice president of the United States? So people started to speculate he was so super intelligent that the problem was with America and then all Americans, that we were too dumb to understand his greatness. So I could always pull a Dan Quayle factor if you leave here saying, well, he wasn't really great. Like you said, well, you could look at it the other way. It was so great. It's just me who couldn't really comprehend the greatness. But okay, the assignment today is to talk about Abraham, Sarah, and their lives and where they come from, etc. And I have personal knowledge of this because I was in Iraq for 1 year, really at the height of the war when the whole country shattered and fell to pieces. Was any thought that Iraq would be a free democratic country? I think that hope was shattered during those years. It was really a bloodbath at that time, and I was in it for the better or worse. Could you hear me without the mic? If it's on? Oh, okay, I'm sorry about that. So those years I did get to travel throughout the country. I was assigned to General Casey's staff. General Casey was the 4-star Allied commander, and I was not specifically assigned there as a rabbi, although, well, because I was a rabbi, but I was assigned there to be on his staff in the multinational forces Iraq, which means I was the deputy force chaplain for all the chaplains and our enlisted personnel throughout Iraq. And we had Polish chaplains, we had Italian chaplains, Australian chaplains, and some others, not just American. So there were about 340 some odd chaplain teams. And when I say teams, I mean chaplains and our enlisted personnel. And I was able to travel throughout Iraq and get to see the different parts of the country. Now, when I begin to speak about Abraham, I want to give you a short Devar Torah that was originally told to me by a Dr. Irving Marvitt, who was in my congregation in my second Torah duty in the early 80s. He was a retired physician, very knowledgeable in Judaism, and he told me this Devar Torah, and I vowed that every year when we'd read Parshas Lech Lecha, in his name and now in his memory, I would give over this Devar Torah. He said this, Lech Lecha means what? Does Can anybody? It means go forth, get thee out, but literally it means something else. It means more literally go to yourself. Be yourself, be the best version of yourself. But if you look at the two words lech lecha, different vowels but the same letters, lech lecha, lech in gematria, the numerical value of lech is what? Plus 20. Lamed and chaf is 20, and 30 is 50. And then lecha, same thing, 50-50. So Dr. Marvitz said very well, he said that God is telling Abraham, you meet me halfway. You go 50% of the way, and I'll meet you the other 50%. And I think this is something we should all remember throughout our lives, that we all face many difficulties and challenges in life, and we carry many burdens. I could look back at my own life, and last January, you're not going to believe me when I say it, but I turned 70 last January. I know I look more like 40 maybe, I wish. But when people say I don't look 70, I said, that's great. But you know what? I feel 80. I've had many surgeries, so many surgeries. I'm on a first name basis with the doctors and nurses already. Just got out of the hospital a few weeks ago. So you carry many burdens in life. I carry many burdens in life, and I'm not going to tell you all my tsuris because I know you have enough of your own. But remember this. Sometimes we want to give up. Sometimes we just want to curse the whole damn world and hide in a cave somewhere. But we can't do that. The message of Abraham is, remember, just give that 50% and God will meet you and he'll give the other 50%. And the whole story of Abraham is just that. Abraham and Sarah is just that we as Jews are apart from the world, but we also have to be a part of the world. We can't run away from the world, no matter all the troubles we have. No, that was Lot and his daughters. So they were in a cave after the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. But I don't think it's a good idea to put your wife in a cave. Okay, so that's the message of Abraham. We still have to be a part of the world and contribute to the world in the best way we can. And that's what Abraham was and what Abraham did, right? Remember when he sat in the doorway of his tent and the three strangers came, the rabbis asked, why was he sitting outside in the heat of the day? Well, why didn't he go into the shade where it was a little cooler? And the answer, because he just had his circumcision and he was recuperating, yet he was sitting out there in the hot sun in the desert. Why? And the answer is because he was looking for wayfarers on the road so he could go and extend to them hospitality. Now, did Abraham stop and say, are you Jewish, sir? Are you Orthodox? Are you conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, Chabad, Havurah? No. To him, a person in need, that was his concern. He didn't ask the religion. He didn't ask anything like that. So the message is that as Jews, we do stand apart from the rest of the world, but we also have to, at the same time, be a part of the world. And I look at Israel today and what's going on. I think that modern Israel has fulfilled that vision of Abraham and Sarah, in that they are so beleaguered and under threat from all sides. And yet Israel is one of the leading contributors to mankind's betterment in medical outreach, in scientific developments to make this world a better place. Imagine from how many millions of Jews in Israel today, 7, 8 million, all of these great technological inventions that extend life and make life better have emerged. Now, getting to the map. Can I attach this maybe, or? Oh, okay. Now getting to the map, I want to point out Abraham and Sarah lived in the Middle Bronze Age. So roughly, all the years I'm going to give you are approximation. Roughly 4,000 years ago. They were born over here in the city of Ur. Ur Kasdim in the Bible, Ur of the Chaldees, which was the cradle of civilization. If you recall from your 4th grade social studies teacher, Mrs. Goldberg or Mrs. Silva or whomever your 4th grade teacher was, my case was Mrs. Rubin, nice old Jewish lady in the Bronx, South Bronx. We studied the cradle of civilization was here, the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Now, why was this is the Euphrates? It goes all the way up into Syria. And here is the Tigris River. And by the way, if you look at the pages with the picture, you'll see we had Tashlich on the Tigris River in 2005. Now, one thing about, it's the bottom on the right, on the last page. You see that photo? That's me with my congregation. And one thing about the Tigris River, you do not want to fall in it because Saddam Hussein, when he was in power, had put man-eating fish in that Tigris River. And the purpose was for him to dump his enemies alive. And he had many enemies. Anyone he didn't like was his enemy, and they would be thrown into that river, and they essentially became fish food. And if you ever see these fish, they really are big and fat on enemies. That's such a crazy, crazy person. We're gonna, what he did. But Ur was a very advanced society 4,000 years ago. They invented the first reliable timekeeping device. They had an agricultural system. They developed like what you would call a municipal bureaucracy. They experimented with irrigation. Because they had the 2 rivers, of course, and that's why it was called the Fertile Crescent. It was fertile. And that was the, they also had cuneiform writing. And they had a system of law that predated the Code of Hammurabi. So it was a very, very advanced society that Abraham and Sarah were born into, or Abraham and Sarai when they were born into it. And they were greatly influenced in a negative way about the society they were born into, meaning it was a pagan society, an idolatrous society, and the main god that they worshiped was the female moon goddess. And they built a monument, a structure, a pyramid in honor of the moon goddess. And I have a nice big photo here. And This is the Great Pyramid of Ur, which in itself was a marvel and a feat of engineering and architecture at the time. It's pretty heavy. Whoops. It was a modern marvel at its time, even today. They figured out that one of the reasons it's lasted this long are these dots over here. Those are called weeping eyes. And they're not glass, there were never glass there. I don't think they didn't have glass at the time. They were just holes that they built. And you could see how evenly they're spaced out. And the purpose was for the water to drain out. If the water was contained within, it would have never lasted this long. Now, I took this picture, it's still there. Now, if these predate the oldest of the Egyptian pyramids by several centuries. Now, what was the purpose of them building this great structure? Purpose was, on top of it, they had an altar to sacrifice to the moon goddess. And what did they sacrifice? Children. The first steps, the first arch appeared in Ur. I'll show you pictures of it later. But there were steps leading up to the top where they sacrificed children. If you ever read the book, The Source by James Michener, it's a wonderful book. It takes a while to read. It's over 1,000 pages. It's worthwhile reading. It gives you a very compelling description of what these rituals were like of child sacrifice. And it wasn't just sacrificing children. There was a whole eroticism, a sexuality to the whole thing. So you can imagine when they would drag these little children up those steps. I think the steps are in one of the pictures, to sacrifice the children screaming their lungs out and crying. And this is not a very big area. It's maybe the size of a few football fields, if even that. So all of the residents, there were 60,000 residents of Ur at the time of Abraham and Sarah, would have had to have heard the screams throughout the day and maybe into the night of poor innocent children being schlepped up the steps to their death on the altar to be sacrificed to the moon goddess. So it doesn't take a great imagination to figure out that Abraham and Sarah couldn't take this, you know, how it would affect them. And they knew intuitively that it wasn't right. Now, surely other people intuitively felt, there had to be some who felt this wasn't a good thing to do or the right thing to do. But it was Abraham and Sarah who went against the grain of the society they were living in and did something about it. And that's why later on in the Torah reading last week or 2 weeks ago, when we read about the sacrifice of Isaac, why was this the test? Because to them, they abhorred they ran away from child sacrifice. So why did this become the test? Because Abraham and Sarah staked their whole lives on this thought that child sacrifice is disgusting. It shouldn't exist. It's animalistic, and we're civilized human beings. And now the God they staked all their hopes in and put their faith in is asking them to kill their child. So what greater test could that have ever been than to ask Abraham to sacrifice his son? By the way, I've had this discussion over the years with many of my Christian colleagues in the Navy, and they have a completely different take on the story. Their take is that this was a good thing because suffering is good, suffering is redemptive, like Jesus died on the cross and his suffering redeemed humanity. So this was something good to sacrifice your son for God. Because suffering is ultimately a good thing. It's redemptive. It connects you to Jesus on the cross. I said, I understand where you're coming from, but I don't accept it. The Jewish way of thinking is suffering is terrible. It's a bad thing. Like Tevye the milkman says in Fiddler on the Roof, God, you've chosen us as your people, but couldn't you choose someone else once in a while? Enough suffering. It's a terrible thing. Ay vey, you know, I'm suffering. So it's not a good thing. It's not redemptive in any way. It's just our tough luck. There's nothing that's going to cleanse us about us with our suffering. And you know what, guys? You are the cause of 90% of our suffering. So we know a thing or two about suffering. And let me tell you, you don't want it. It's not good. But that's where Abraham and Sarah came from and the society they emerged from. Now, let's see if we can move back. You can see also, this is Sarah and Abraham's house. And the father of Abraham was who? Terach. Terach did what for a living? He was a purveyor of idols. And how do we know that this was Abraham and Sarah's house? Because Sarah was a Jewish wife, and most Jewish wives keep a pretty tidy house. So you could see it's, well, in my case, I'm a Jewish husband, and I keep a tidy house. Just joking. My wife's not here, so I could tell some of those stories. But how did we know this was their home? Because in those days, being a purveyor of idols was a very good profession. You could make a good living doing it. You know, Machleben, a parnasa, it was a good parnasa. And it was a very carefully regulated profession, and you had to have a license. And the license was written on a clay tablet, and they found a clay tablet in this area with Terach's name on it and authorization to, in fact, be a purveyor of idols. Not everybody could do it. And Abraham wanted no part of it, right? He smashed the idols of his father. Why didn't he want to be an idol purveyor? You know why? Because it's like being a rabbi. What kind of job is that for a nice Jewish boy? That was a joke, by the way. So he went into a different profession. There you can see that pretty closely. Okay, this is Daif. I don't know if he's there anymore. I don't know if he's alive. Very nice Muslim Iraqi. And he is was the caretaker of this whole area. At night, he's the only one there. And it must be pretty creepy. There are no lights, there's no electricity. But for him, this is a ministry. He feels it's his mission in life to take care of Abraham's and Sarah's home. Very nice man. This was the tomb of the kings. There were I think something like 70 kings were buried here, different kings from Ur, from Mesopotamian kings. But it wasn't just the kings. When the king was buried, not the pharaoh, but the king was buried, the Chaldean kings, they were buried with their servants, men, women servants alive. And all their gold and all their riches were buried with them. And the where most of them were put was in here. So imagine burying all of these kings over the centuries with their whole administration, basically, young men and women, which leads to the question, of course, before they suffocated or died, was there any nookie going on? And probably, I think there was. But they figured, what the hell, we're not getting out of here anyway. So how did this emerge to civilization? Basically, Ur was out of business around the time of the destruction of the first temple. First temple was destroyed in 586 BCE. Basically, Ur was already pretty much gone. It wasn't the major city anymore. Why was that? Because the waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates became very silty, and it could no longer grow crops and sustain life. So they had to move elsewhere. Okay, this picture was taken in Haran, what is reputed to be Haran. Look on your map, please, if you will, for a moment. Do you see all the way where it's Turkey begins? Okay, if you see where it says Nineveh, Nineveh, of course, is known to us from the story of Jonah. If you're not familiar, we read it on Yom Kippur. God bless you. If you're not familiar with the story, please read it. It's a short story, a short book of the Bible. Please read it. It's a whale of a story. But if you move your finger directly up from where the N is in Nineveh, and you stop before the line, the border line to Turkey, that is where Haran is, where Abraham and Sarah stopped on the way to the promised land. And apparently Terach, the idol man, well, he owned a business called Idols Are Us, and he was looking to establish a franchise in Haran. Just joking, I'm joking. But he apparently was with them in Haran and remained there, and Abraham and Sarah and their retinue continued. But this is Haran. There's not much there except one thing. There's one thing, and look how it's, there's really nothing. Except I don't have a picture, I couldn't find it, but I was with a group of Marines when we passed through Haran, and there were these mounds of earth. There must have been like 6 or 7 mounds of earth, and the Marine captain said, "Chaplain, that's where there's a burial site for the soldiers who died in the Iraq-Iran war, which lasted like 10 years. So I said, "Oh, you mean there's a soldier buried under each of those?" He said to me, "Chaplain, the remains of 10,000 soldiers from both sides are buried in each of those mounds." No one knows how many Iranian, Iraqi soldiers were killed during the war, but the lowest estimates are between 70 and 80,000 soldiers, the lowest estimates. The highest estimates go over 250,000. And ultimately, that folly, that war, was the genesis of our involvement in the war and the downfall of Saddam Hussein. Now, there are those who say that Haran was right over the border in Turkish boundaries, but there are those who say it was south of the border, like Pedro's south of the border. This is Haran south of the border. And why do I tend to side with those who say it was right below the border in Iraq itself and not Turkey? Because I was there and I have pictures of it, and it's a great story to tell to groups like this that I was in Haran. I wasn't in Turkey. I was in Turkey, but nowhere near there. And you could see on that page some of the folklore or lore about Iraq. And we also know it, that's where Babylonia was. And Babylonia plays a huge part in the Bible and in post-Bible history of the Jewish people. Now, who can say what happened in Babylonia that is of interest to the Jews post-Bible days? It was the center of gravity of Jewish life after the destruction of the Second Temple. And the Talmud emerged out of the Babylonian yeshivas, notably Pumbedisa and what was the other one? Surah and Pumbedisa. Now, if you look at your map again, Surah is halfway between Baghdad and Ramadi. Ramadi is over, this is Baghdad. Back to the map. Okay, Baghdad is over here, and Surah, excuse me, Pumbedisa is over here. Ramadi is over here on the Euphrates. Now, if you finger over here, Baghdad, and go over here to Ramadi, and then you trace with your finger up here, that is the Sunni triangle where most of the fighting was and most of the casualties. And the reason that the Americans were there because we were in the war most deeply, but there were other areas of Iraq where there wasn't as much fighting. It was relatively peaceful, like the northern region where the Kurds were relatively peaceful. So they put the Korean military there because the politicians knew in Korea that once they started to take heavy casualties, the South Korean populace would not support it, and they would demand that their troops be brought back home. But we were taking, when I was there in the Sunni Triangle, where the American forces were concentrated, we were getting whacked. It was really bad. But that is the Sunni Triangle, where you have Fallujah, which is Pumbedisa. There was a big battle in Fallujah. And Tikrit, more north that I pointed out on the Euphrates. Saddam Hussein was from Tikrit, and that's where the Big Red One, the 1st Infantry Division, found him hiding in a cave, looking like a caveman, in fact. And when the troops found him in that hole, imagine this guy was billionaire. He had all the riches of Iraq, killed tens of thousands of his own people, and had all the wealth in the world at his disposal, not the world of Iraq. And here he is in a hole, and some young troops from the Big Red One found him. First thing he said was, I'm ready to talk to George Bush. Well, George Bush wasn't ready to talk to him, and the rest is history. Okay, but the Talmud emerged from those great yeshivas. Now, if you go back to the page where you have the pictures, there are, what, 10 pictures, 9 pictures? Let me go through this quickly. How much time do we have left? Oh, okay, we go to 12, good. I could talk till 12 tomorrow or midnight. Okay, the top picture is Sir Leonard Woolley. Does that name ring a bell to anyone? He was considered he was an Englishman. If you remember Indiana Jones, he was at Oxford. A lot of these great archaeologists of the late 19th century and early 20th century came out of Oxford, and they were Brits. They came out of Oxford, and they were world-class archaeologists. But they also, a lot of people don't know this, but Oxford and the University of Pennsylvania, UP, had kind of a joint venture going on. So some of the archaeologists were not from Oxford. They may have studied at Oxford for a while, but they were from Americans from UP. And I believe, I've never been on the UP campus. I don't know if I want to go to the UP campus these days, but they have a museum supposedly with a number of the artifacts. In any event, Woolley is considered the first modern archaeologist because he went about archaeology in a very methodical way. He kept notes, any little thing they found, he'd make diagrams, kept notes about it. And it was brought back to England and cataloged and studied. And he brought aboard his team to excavate Iraq. He brought aboard an assistant, a young assistant. His name was Max Malawan. And he was young at the time in the 1920s, but as time went by, he got older. He became also a world-class archaeologist. And they were both knighted by the king. Woolley was knighted in 1935 by Queen Elizabeth's father. If you saw the movie The King's Speech, that was Queen Elizabeth's daddy, King Charles's grandfather. He was knighted in 1935 by him, and Max Malawan was knighted by a young Queen Elizabeth in the 1950s. Max Malawan married someone we all know, Agatha Christie, and her husband's work in Mesopotamia became the basis for one or two of her novels, so mystery novels. And Max was already deceased, and she was interviewed on the old Dick Cavett show. If you're older, you remember the old Dick Cavett show. And he asked Agatha Christie, who must have been in her 90s at the time, how was it being married to a world-class archaeologist? So she said, it was great. The older I got, the more interested in me he became. So I guess it was the perfect shidduch, a shidduch von Himmel, as they say. And by the way, in my long Navy career, I made 6 shidduchim, mostly with military personnel. And one of them, believe it or not, was in Iraq, where I got 2 young Jewish soldiers together, united in holy matrimony. So could you imagine, with all that noise and all that fighting, making a shidduch in that environment? So what does that tell you? You know, despite the horrors of war and all its nastiness, love will triumph, true love. Some of these shidduchim, they produced children, and now we're getting on into grandchildren. And you could read about it in one of the shidduchim I made if you go online, there's a story on the OU website called The Sabbath Bride, about a master gunnery sergeant in Marines and his wife that I made the shidduch. And on the next, okay, one other thing that I love, the sidelights, the CNN factoids, if you will, behind the story. The big machas at UP that were co-sponsoring Woolley and Malouin in the excavation expressed some concern. And let me read it to you. They expressed concern to Woolley about this. And it's a direct quote from a Professor Gordon at UP. Perhaps the presence of a lone woman with 4 men in camp makes a more interesting figure for some of them than the outline of ziggurats. Now, that is not politically correct to say such a thing. However, having been a Navy chaplain with young male and female Marines and soldiers, you know they're going to find a way to get together, no matter what. However, Leonard Woolley and his wife never consummated the marriage. And that was she was, I guess, like a liberated woman, and she was also a Bissela Meshuggah, which is important for you to know. Everybody knows what a Bissela Meshuggah means. I hope. He's just a little crazy. She was an educated woman, but crazy. She made it one of the conditions before they were married, she would marry him, that they would never consummate the marriage. They would never be physically intimate. And that lasted a few years, and then Leonard said goodbye and good luck to her. But to get back at him, one absolute proof that you could point to that would indicate the story of Terach and Abraham was true is that clay tablet that was his license to be an idol purveyor. Where is it? It was lost. What happened? When Leonard informed his wife that, I think her name was Catherine, when he informed her that the marriage was over because of her disinterest in physical intimacy, she got really upset. So she took the clay tablet and threw it in the Thames River. So it's buried there in the silt somewhere. It's the one really piece of physical evidence that I don't think will ever be retrieved that you could point to saying Abraham was here. Certainly Terach. If you look at the pictures, you'll see what the ziggurat looked like, maybe looked like in biblical, when it actually existed in its heyday. The next picture is a statue with gold leaf. It's wood in the inside. It's not all gold, solid gold, that Woolley found at the site of the ziggurat. It's in the London Museum now. It's called Ram in the Thicket. Now, why do you think that they made a statue in Ur called it's a ram in the thicket? Why did they choose that as a subject? Right, the ram got caught in the thicket. Instead of Isaac was 37 at the time of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. And we think he was a kid, but he was 37, the way they figure it out. So Abraham was famous in his lifetime. So kind of as a tribute to Ur's favorite son, they made this, commissioned this statue. I don't know if it was an idol that they worship, but it was found right at the site of where the pharaohs were buried. And they found a lot of stuff. Like the Egyptian pyramids, most of them were pillaged over the centuries. But because Ur was abandoned 2,500 years ago, and it's in the middle of the desert, it wasn't pillaged, and they found thousands of artifacts, and many of them are like this, with gold and silver and so forth. And there's discussion now about whether England should turn over all these graves that were robbed, basically. It wasn't nice of the Brits to do. When I was in grade school, we thought these archaeologists were big heroes, but the fact is they were grave robbers and pillaging the ancient artifacts of indigenous peoples. So there's discussion now about whether they should return all of those objects. And obviously, when officials are asked about it, they offer nice words, but of course they don't want to do it because firstly, they're a great tourist attraction. And secondly, there's a lot of pride associated with these finds in England because it harkens back to when the sun never set on the English Empire. So long gone days. And then another, oh, by the way, not Max, but Leonard Woolley was very, very close to another archaeologist by the name of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And together they excavated Carchemish, which was a famous site in modern day Syria. Another CNN factoid. Did you all see the movie Lawrence of Arabia? With, I think, who was the star? Who was Lawrence in the movie? You can fact check. I'm going to say it was Peter O'Toole. So if someone could go online here and fact check me. But Lawrence of Arabia and T.E. Lawrence were the first archaeological team to map out the Sinai. And they were sponsored by the British during World War I. Now, the English had an ulterior motive for commissioning them to map out the Sinai, and that was England was at war already in 1915, 1916, World War I, not II, and they were fighting Turkey in the Middle East. And the Turks were threatening to invade Egypt through the Sinai. So the British government, the military, wanted intel about the Sinai, the terrain and so forth, so they would know what to expect if they had to fight the Egyptians in the Sinai. And you know what? When you study history, you realize one thing: history always repeats itself. Like the famous saying, those who forget the lessons of history are condemned to repeat them. The picture here is Rav Ashi at the Sura Yeshiva. So the three great yeshivas were Sura, Nahar Dor, and Pumbedisa. Now I'm going to read about from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, whose yahrzeit it was this week or last week. Are you all familiar with Rabbi Sachs? Jonathan Sachs, he was a very great man, and he was very highly respected in the British Empire, Commonwealth, I guess it could be called. He was very close with the former Prime Minister Blair, Tony Blair. They used to have, a lot of people don't know this, but they used to meet in the morning several times a week, one-on-one, where Rabbi Sachs would teach him Torah, teach him Chumash, because Tony Blair felt there were a lot of important lessons that can be drawn from Parshas HaShavua. And Rabbi Sachs had such a great appeal that he was able to speak to everyone, from prime ministers to the common man or woman. I'm going to read from his book. This is a 5-part book, follows Parshas HaShavua with some of Rabbi Sachs's insights. If I could find the page that is. Sorry. Okay. He's talking about Abraham here. To be sure, he is a man of exemplary virtue. He welcomes strangers and gives them food. He fights the battle on behalf of the cities of the plain in order to rescue his nephew Lot. He prays for Sodom in one of the greatest dialogues in religious literature. He patiently waits for a child, and then when the command comes, is willing to offer him a sacrifice, only to discover the God of truth does not want us to sacrifice our children, but to cherish them. But if we were asked to characterize him with adjectives, the words that spring to mind, gentle, kind, gracious, are not those usually associated with the founder of a new faith. They are the kind of attributes to which any of us could aspire. None of us can be an Abraham, but all of us can take him as a role model. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of all. And then he quotes Lionel Trilling, who says that the concept of courage, gevura, is not explicitly spoken about by the rabbis' rabbinic literature, but Rabbi Sachs disagrees with that assessment. Trilling says the Greeks and other cultures did speak about heroism and courage. A hero is one convinced of his or her own importance. He is conscious of playing a part on the world stage under the admiring gaze of his contemporaries. The rabbis, said Trilling, would have been quite ready to understand the definition of the hero as an actor, and to say that, as such, he was undeserving of the attention of serious men. Abraham, this is not Trilling, this is Sachs. Abraham is a paradigm of an unheroic hero. Great words, an unheroic hero. One who, in Maimonides' lovely phrase, does what is right because it is right, and not for the sake of popularity or fame. As the founder of Judaism, Abraham gives us a vision of what it is to live directly and immediately in the presence of God, who knows our thoughts, our hopes, our fears, our dreams. This involves a radically new kind of heroism, the heroism of ordinary life, of decency and goodness, integrity and faithfulness, the humble, unostentatious heroism of being willing to live by one's convictions though all the world thinks otherwise, being true to the call of eternity, not the noise of the new. And this is so profound, and what I tried to say before about Judaism asks us to be apart from the world and its values in some ways, but also to be a part of the world. I recommend to you a great book. I think you could find it on Amazon, but maybe only in used form. But I don't think it's on Kindle. But even in used form, they're usually in pretty good shape. unless it's indicated otherwise. It's called Where Judaism Differed. Is anybody familiar with that book? You are. And it was written by Rabbi Abba Hillel Silver. I think it was written in the 30s. Could you briefly, in one sentence, summarize its theme? You remember it? Right. And that in every age, the Jews stood apart from the dominant culture and society they lived in because they necessarily had to reject a lot of what the society that they lived in stood for. And it was an interesting premise, and it's important to understand the book because this, in large part, is a major reason, is reason the right word? It's a major factor in anti-Semitism throughout the ages. And Rabbi Sachs expounded on this as well, and he asked the question, why is it that anti-Semitism is the oldest hatred? Why did it endure for millenniums? I mean, there were hated groups of people throughout history, but the hatred didn't continue. Either the people disappeared or people got tired of hating them and they made some kind of truce or understanding with them, kind of like the American people and the American Indians. We decided we're not going to fight each other. The Indians accepted that the Americans were here to stay. They're Americans, but that the government was here to stay and they were expanding westward on their territories. So they kind of accepted it and they made a deal with the tribal nations. They're still called nations, by the way. So, but why did anti-Semitism endure? And one of the reasons he comes up with is because anti-Semitism was able to morph in every generation, in every epoch. And you think about it, it's so true. I mean, you have anti-Semitism in Pharaoh's days, Moses' days. Why? Because they needed cheap labor, so they had the slaves. They didn't necessarily care about, oh, we worshiped Hashem. I don't think that was terribly important to them, but they needed cheap labor. In terms of the Spanish Inquisition, that was a time when the church was preeminent in Europe. And the church was interested in keeping the Jews down for religious, theological reasons. Why? Because we rejected their Messiah. And it bothered them so much that they had to torture us at times, like during the Crusades, and they had to keep us down when they weren't busy killing us. And then in more modern times, you had economic anti-Semitism, where the Jews were accused of being communists on the one hand and ruining the capitalistic model of finance. And you had anti-Semites saying the opposite, accusing us of being the capitalists and then destroying the countries we were living in by taking control of the banks and so forth, the Rothschilds and what have you. And in the Nazi era, there was anti-Semitism based on genetics, that even if you converted, even generations ago, you still had Jewish genes in you, and you were subject to persecution. And if you were a full-blooded Jew, you were going to a concentration camp. And now the new phenomenon is that the Jews are colonialists and we rob people of their rightful lands and deny them of their human rights. And the watchword today is human rights. And the anti-Semites see the Jews as the paradigm of violators of indigenous people's human rights. So basically, he was saying, no matter what, we can't win. There's always going to be anti-Semitism. Modern Zionism, Herzlian Zionism, was a recognition of that fact, that the Jews will never fully be accepted into modern civilization. No matter what we do, we could stand on our heads and have all these Nobel Prize winners and do great things. No matter what, we'll never be fully accepted. And the only answer to it is to have our own country and our own land with our own army, our own air force, and our own navy. Because we'll never appease the anti-Semites, so we have to do what they did, and that is be strong and be muscular. And if anybody is familiar with the first chief rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, he was the embodiment of that. He said the Jews have to be strong, not just spiritually, of course, have to be strong physically, but he said that the Jews have to be strong physically as well as spiritually. And he himself was a vegetarian. He ate a really healthy diet, and they say that he was trim, he was fit, so he practiced what he preached. Okay, now Sarah, just to get to Sarah for a minute. Sarah plays an important part in yesterday's Torah reading as well, although it begins basically with her death, and that how Abraham tried to find a proper burial place for her. And it's interesting about Sarah that in any literature of that period, and for probably another 15 centuries, women are not seen as the protagonists in their own story. Women are always portrayed as someone's wife, somebody's daughter, as a bystander to the men that the literature is about, but never a prime mover or a central character. Even though Sarah is not the central character of these Torah readings, she is the second cast member, second billing next to Abraham. She, in a very important way, is the prime mover of the entire story and not Abraham. But because she's working behind the scenes, and in a simple reading, you would say, well, there's Abraham and then there's Sarah. But if you really look deeply into the story with discerning eyes, you will see that it was really Sarah and then Abraham, because she called a lot of the shots and she was responsible for the continuity of the Jewish people and the preservation of the faith. Because remember this, one of the primary ideas of Judaism is that Judaism could not survive without the Jewish people, and the Jewish people cannot survive without Judaism or the Torah. So it was really Sarah who was responsible. Of course, God made a covenant with Abraham, but it was really Sarah who put into motion the whole wheel on which Judaism was able to survive throughout the centuries. Even in Christian literature, there's a parallel drawn between Sarah and Mary, the mother of Jesus. And one of the reasons, I guess, is because Sarah was very old. I think she was 87, was it, when she gave birth to Isaac. So it's kind of that virgin thing mixed in, although she was obviously not a virgin. But they make parallels between the two. And even more interestingly, in Islamic literature, Sarah is portrayed almost exactly the way she is in the Torah, i.e., very, very favorably. And they don't try to put her down because she was a Jewess in any way that I know of. Oh, okay, so we'll open to questions. Always like when I'm in a conference with that's a general or admiral speaking, no one wants to be the first to ask the question. So who is the first to answer the question? For the long silence, who is the first one to ask the question? The Schlemiel from the South Bronx sitting all the way in the back. I'm talking about me at a conference. You mean they didn't go back to where Ur was, or that region of Mesopotamia or Babylon could not support life. I mean, even now, it can't support life. If you go there, you would need containers of water and all the supplies, MREs we had. You can't, there's no electrical grid or flowing water. It can't be, but it is only 10 miles away from Nasiriyah, which is a big city, and where there was a big battle during the invasion. And that's where Jessica Lynch was captured with her compatriots during the invasion. You're talking about the parts I mentioned where the yeshivas were. One reason was because the land of Israel or Judea was pretty much destroyed. And don't forget, it was still under the Roman yoke. So I guess you could compare it to survivors of the Shoah. Most of them did not return to their place of origin. They went to either Palestine at the time or Canada, or Australia, and many to America. Maybe it was the idea that this is no longer the place we can live because the conditions and politically, economically are so poor. And Babylonia was a land of riches and opportunities. So much so that the Talmud was codified, I believe, in the year 600 CE. The Mishnah was developed in the Promised Land, but the Talmud was developed in Babylon at those three main yeshivas I mentioned, Sura, Nadar, and Pumbedisa. Rav Ashi and Ravina founded the Great Academy of Learning at Pumbedisa. And that was a big part. There's a picture of Rav Ashi giving a class there. A Babylonian Talmud emerged in the 600s, and a Yerushalmi Talmud developed parallel to that. But the Yerushalmi, like Jerusalemite in Israel, there were still scholars and yeshivas, but not as prominent and not as authoritative as in Babylon, which became the center of gravity of Jewish learning and Jewish life. So today, the Talmud Yerushalmi is studied by scholars, but not the general public. Like Daf Yomi is exclusively built around the Talmud Bavli, because the Yerushalmi is not considered, let's say, let's put it this way. The Yerushalmi is like a first aid book you know, how to bandage somebody up or stop somebody who's bleeding on the side of the road after a car accident, where the Bavli is a whole big library of books on brain surgery. You know, it's very in-depth, very methodical, very scholarly. And the center of Jewish life was in Babylonia and the great yeshivas. Why it was? That's where the wandering people, I guess, and life was better than in Judea at the time. Almost like, I'll give you another analogy. When Cyrus allowed the Jews to return and to rebuild the temple, after the first 70 years after the first destruction, many Jews remained in Persia because life was good for the Jews in Persia, and they said, it says in our holy books, if I forget thee, O Jerusalem, my right hand forget its cunning. Well, it was a nice statement, but the fact is, many Jews didn't want to leave Persia after the first exile. You know what Ben Gurion said the definition of an American Zionist is? One Jew who sends a second Jew to live in Israel with a third Jew's money. You could ask, why don't we all, you know, move to Israel? What's the attraction of living in the diaspora? Well, the attraction is we have nice big cars and houses, and, you know, it's we're comfortable living where we were born, basically. Many factors, human, psychological, economic, one or all of the above. But in any country, like the golden age of Spain for the Jews, where the Jews were treated well, emerged great scholars, great rabbis, great Jewish literature. In this case, the Talmud. In Spain, during the golden age of Spain, we had some of the greatest rabbis and the greatest Jewish literature, rabbinic literature, as well as general literature to emerge from the golden age of Spain. So when the Jews have it good in any given land, they can really live out their best selves and make all these wonderful contributions. Good question. Any other, please? Yes, there were some in Turkey, in Spain. In Spain, I was actually invited to speak at a major synagogue, which had been plundered and looted during the Spanish Inquisition. So you think about God bless you, you think about the historical weight that you would feel on your shoulders and such a thing as that. I was in Babylon in Iraq and a few other places of Jewish interest, but the main ones were the ones I pointed out in Tikrit, Ramadi, Fallujah, Baghdad, and of course Ur. Yeah, and also I've been to many modern Jewish communities that had been before World War II, the Shoah, were big thriving Jewish communities, and now they may have a Jewish community, but not like it was before the war. Any other questions or comments? I will conclude with this. From yesterday's, it wasn't yesterday's Torah reading, it was 2 weeks ago, Parshas Vayera. Remember, Abraham argued with God about saving the people Sodom and Gomorrah. And the rabbis draw a parallel with Noah. When God told Noah to build an ark because he was going to destroy the world, Noah said, aye, aye, sir, and followed God's instructions and built the ark. But when Abraham was told by God he was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham started to argue and bargain with God. If there are 50 righteous people, we'll destroy 40 and so forth. So, of course, that bargaining, Jews are good at bargaining, supposedly. So he was the first Jew, so he had to strike a bargain. And unfortunately for the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, the bargain wasn't accepted. But who survived? Lot, his wife, and the 2 daughters. But Lot's wife turned around and she turned into a pillar of salt. And rabbis have a field day with making sermons out of it. You can't look back in life. You have to move forward, my dear friends. And we are moving forward with a new building fund. I tell my rabbinic colleagues, I was so happy how much I admire them, because they have to deal with boards of directors and shul president. I'm sorry, I mean, I know you're a great shul president, but a lot of my colleagues, there's conflict with the trustees and the board and contracts and all of this, and they have to deal with that. My elder late brother was a rabbi at Sinai Temple, where the actors and actresses go, the Hollywood people. He was followed by Rabbi Walpe, you may have heard of. But they have it tough. I say to them, I admire you for doing this. In my rabbinic career, the worst I had to deal with was Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. It was a piece of cake. If something happened to me and I was killed by an IED or something, it'd be over like that. Their death is like a long, tortured years of torture. Me, it would be over in a second. I wouldn't know what hit me. But what happened? The older daughter they hid in a cave in the plain of Zoar, remember? And they believed all civilization was destroyed, not just Sodom and Gomorrah. They did not think there were any other people alive anywhere. So they came up with a plan. The old daughter they planned one night, they'd get their father drunk, Lot, have sexual relations with him, get pregnant, and have a child. And then the second night, the younger daughter would do the same, an incestuous relationship. The older daughter did get pregnant. She gave birth to a son and named him Moab. He is the ancestor of the people of Moab until the present day. The younger daughter also gave birth to a son and named him Ben-Ami, which means son of my kindred. He is the ancestor of the people of Ammon until this present day. Now, both the Moabites and the Ammonites in the Tanakh, through history, gave the Jewish people, the Israelites, a tough time. And the Jews were commanded not to marry with them, and because terrible things would happen. And yet, there was a Jewish man who did marry a Moabite woman, and who was that? What? Who in the Tanakh? Naomi, she didn't marry, she married a Jew, Elkanah. But one of her sons married Ruth, who was a Moabite, and the other one also married a shiksa, quote unquote. So You weren't supposed to marry a Moabite specifically. That was not a good thing to do if you were a Jew. And yet she later on married after the death of the son, and she and Naomi came to the Promised Land, and she married a Jewish man by the name of Boaz. And out of that union came King David. King David is, his descendant will be Mashiach, the Messiah. So you think about how profound this story is and what it means that the Jewish people pin all of their hopes for salvation and redemption and an end of the exile, a return to Israel, the rebuilding of the temple, the resurrection of the dead. We pin all of those dreams and hopes to a story that emanates with the destruction of great cities and death raining from above and an incestuous act. And I told this many times to my Christian counterparts in the military chaplain corps, that you too, you believe that Jesus was a descendant of David, meaning his provenance begins with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and incestuous relationship. And how profound is that thought, that we don't think of our Mashiach as somebody who came from grew up in a royal, or his roots are in royalty. His roots are in a palace and splendor and some great war hero. It begins not modestly, but with utter destruction. And they too believe their Messiah began that way. They have to, it's undeniable. And one of the first things you read in the New Testament is about Jesus's lineage going back to David, because if they claim that that Jesus was a Messiah, he had to have been a descendant of David. So we both, Jews and Christians, have that like belief. And the message for us is we are living in a time of destruction and despair and horrible things happening all over the world, and what's going on in Gaza and Israel being threatened, what's going on in college campuses. It's so natural that we would give up hope and say, I've had enough. I don't want to listen to the news. I don't want to do anything. All I want to do is go to Dairy Queen and order a banana split and stuff my face. I don't care what's happening in the world. It's too terrible. But the message is, out of tragedy, out of darkness, out of war, out of bloodshed, could come our greatest dream of hope and redemption and salvation and the unity of the world and all nations. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
I want to thank Rabbi Shantz for being here this morning. Our next biblical person talk will be be sure and check